Turkey's oldest and largest opposition party, the CHP, is in crisis mode after a controversial court ruling last month ousted its leadership. Critics say the decision was politically motivated to tighten President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's grip on power. Critics warn of democratic backsliding in Turkey, a country that aspires to join the European Union. But so far, Europe's response has been muted. DW's Julia Hahn reports.
These scenes have shocked many across Turkey. Riot police seen forcing their way into the headquarters of the CHP, the country's largest opposition party. They use water cannons and tear gas against the party's resisting supporters. But apart from a few tweets and statements expressing concern, Europe's response has been remarkably restrained. Why? Nacho Sanchez Amor is the European Parliament's lead expert on Turkey. He's been tracking the country's democratic record and its long-stalled bid to join the European Union.
The silence is the result of a bad assessment of the whole relation with Turkey. The level of repression is so blatantly clear that it's not a minor signal of going backwards. It's a trend.
The confrontation did not come out of nowhere. Opposition parties in Turkey have faced years of mounting pressure. A controversial court ruling in May is merely the latest flashpoint. It removed CHP leader Özgür Özel and reinstated former chairman Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who lost the 2023 presidential election to Erdogan. Critics see the decision as part of a wider crackdown on the opposition. In the past 2 years, hundreds of CHP politicians and officials have been arrested over alleged corruption charges, among them Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu. He was widely regarded as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's strongest challenger. But Turkey is still officially a candidate for EU membership. So what's driving Europe's silence? Part of the answer is geopolitics. Turkey has NATO's second largest military and controls access to the Black Sea, crucial in the EU's security calculations as Russia's war against Ukraine continues. Many European governments increasingly see Ankara as strategically indispensable.
Turkey is a very important country for many aspects and many parts of our relation. And one of these parts is security and defense.
A decade ago, European leadership was far more vocal about Turkey's democratic backsliding. But today, priorities have shifted. Energy security, migration, regional conflicts. These concerns now dominate the relationship between Brussels and Ankara. And that appears to give President Erdogan more room to maneuver.
This is our blindness. Our blindness is requested by the Turks is, please, let's talk about security and defense, let's talk about pipelines, let's talk about custom unions, but please, don't look to the prisons. Don't look to the civil society. Don't look to the journalists. Don't look to the LGBT people. Don't look to the universities.
For many opposition supporters, the silence is felt on the ground.
Europe needs to support the people in this country. We have members of parliament, mayors, students who were detained. They're throwing everyone who speaks out into jail.
They are acting pragmatically, prioritizing their own national interests. But we, as the Turkish people, feel like we've been left alone.
President Erdogan portrays the CHP's crisis as an internal party conflict. His government rejects accusations it is using the courts to target political opponents and that it is moving away from democratic norms. Observers disagree.
The European Union is still a club of democracies. And for that reason, we have to repeat to the Turkish authorities, if you want to really join the European Union, this is not about military power, this is not about geopolitics, this is not about trade, this is about democracy.
For many here in Turkey, the concerns now go far beyond one opposition party. What will the next elections look like if the pressure continues? And will Europe find its voice again?
Angela Ziccardi is a foreign policy analyst at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I asked her how far apart the EU and Turkey are when it comes to democratic values.
Of course, looking at what's happening on the ground right now, looking at the current domestic situation in Turkey, we have to admit and we have to recognize that we're talking of a competitive authoritarianism over there. So especially looking at what President Erdogan is conducting in terms of securing another term, despite the constitutional veto on that. So it's of course complicated to admit that in Turkey, we can still witness a democratic, let's say, rule of law and power, terms speaking. At the same time, we have to say that Turkish population still hopes for democratization and a good following of the rule of law, especially looking at data and looking at polls. This is quite visible. At the CFR, we used to conduct surveys witnessing that. So witnessing that Turkish population is still willing to also join the EU in a certain way. However, the situation on the ground is quite complicated.
So the Turkish people, according to these polls, do seem to be siding still with democracy, but democratic backsliding in Turkey is well documented. We had a report on that just now. We heard the EU Parliament's rapporteur on Turkey say that the trend there is towards repression. If the EU does deepen its cooperation with Turkey without demanding democratic reforms, does it not risk undermining its own credibility? Does it not strengthen the perception of the EU having double standards?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, this is an already current trend, not only looking at the Turkish scenario, but also looking at other countries. Of course, the Turkish case is different, given that we're still talking about a EU candidate country. So we should be really cautious here in, of course, forging new partnerships with a country that is following this authoritarian backsliding in a certain way. But at the same time, looking at EU credibility as a whole, we have to admit that problems in this sense can be visible also in other relationships with other countries, and the risk of double standards is really high, also looking from the Turkish perspective. For instance, in Turkey, it has been quite criticized the last agreement, the last deal that the European Union signed with India in terms of economic and trade advantages. Because, of course, Turkey is trying to advance the customs union set up in a certain way from ages, we can say. So the risk of double standards is high, but at the same time, we should be pragmatic and look at what's on the table right now.
In our report that we just showed, we saw some Turkish protesters accusing the EU of turning a blind eye when it comes to what they see as a crackdown on Turkey's opposition. Can those protesters expect any support from Brussels?
Yeah, Brussels, especially looking at the last years, so when actually after the arrest of Imamoglu, has been vocal just verbally in supporting the opposition. If we have to be honest, we haven't witnessed really support for the CHP as a whole, for the protests as a whole, despite being vocally. So, of course, from looking at the EU values, also the following of the real law, the democratization standards, and so forth, the European Union, as you mentioned before, the Special Rapporteur, Nacho Sanchez-Amor, is one of the most vocal in this case, will continue to support, to advocate for avoiding what's happening on the ground. So it's gonna support the protests. But unfortunately, I don't see really possibility of changes in this regard. And we also have to consider that, of course, what we are witnessing today, it's negative, but it's something that is on the ground from last year. So everything started last year with the arrest of Imamoglu, and nothing really changed after that. So it's a trend in progress, and the EU hasn't been vocal as we witnessed from before, I'd say.
Angela, thank you very much for your insights. That was Angela Ziccardi of the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you.